Sunday morning, jumped out of bed and put on my best suit. Got in my car and raced like a jet all the way to you. Walked in your church with heart in my hand to ask you a question, 'cause I know that you're a Calvinist friend. Yeah. Can I question your doctrine without any strife? Say yes, 'cause I need to know. Say I'll never get your blessing till the day I die. Tough luck, my friend, but why you gotta be so rude? Don't you know I'm Christian too? Why you gotta be so rude? I'm gonna question you anyway. Question tulip, question you anyway. Question tulip, yeah, no matter what you say. Question tulip, ain't what it ought to be. Why you gotta be so rude?
Welcome to Sociology 101. You know, when we start with the Why You Gotta Be So Rude music, we're probably going to be answering one of our favorite apologists, Dr. James White, of course. Yesterday, he did a broadcast, again, confronting my broadcast, and so I'm going to respond. Unlike some people who just ignore James White, I actually like to have my interlocutor, my nemesis, if you will, and I say that in love, but at the same time, I think you're going to enjoy today's program because James White pretty much tells us all that determinism is a joke. You'll see what I mean. You can hear him for yourself, but he pretty much laughs what he believes out of the room. And that's what's interesting about this particular program is that when he's mocking me, he's actually mocking me for saying something that's true about his own system. And that's ironic, if nothing else. As we've said before, some things don't have to be refuted. Some arguments don't even have to be refuted. They just have to be clearly stated, because when you clearly state them, it becomes obvious to everyone in the room who is intuitively not dedicated to a particular worldview, at least, that it becomes obvious that the argument fails in and of itself. It's just laughable. It's ridiculous. It's absurd. And that's exactly what you ultimately have James White, whether he recognizes it or not. He ultimately admits that in this program by laughing at his own system. He laughs at determinism. And I think that's why you'll see why this is so funny as we listen to it. Let's play. This is from yesterday, by the way. This is brand new. He just responded to a clip that was recently put out with me and Mike Winger talking about open theism. So let's listen in. Let me know, sound-wise guys, on the side chat if this sounds okay.
Everybody sent this to me, and I appreciate that. Well, and I say everybody. Okay, that was a little bit of an exaggeration. There's a little bit more there. A lot of people mentioned this to me, that there was a discussion between Leighton Flowers and Mike Winger about open theism. And you know what I've said more than once about Leighton Flowers and open theism and all sorts of stuff out there. I think if open theism had not been specifically added, and I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty certain that it was the last revision of the Baptist Faith and Message in 2000 that included the specific assertion that precludes a faithful Southern Baptist from holding to the Baptist Faith and Message and believing in open theism. I think if it hadn't been for that Leighton Flowers would be an open theist today.
Okay, so his assertion is Leighton Flowers would be an open theist if the Baptist Faith and Message in 2000 didn't insert in there that you can't be a Baptist and an open theist. That's his assertion. One, my particular denomination, Texas Baptist, does not require anyone to adhere to the 2000 Baptist Faith and Message. In fact, there was a divide within Texas over that issue with regard to the 63 versus the 2000, mostly based upon certain more dogmatic statements that the 2000 said with regard to women in ministry and those kinds of things, and certain Texas Baptists don't like being told what to do by state denominations and confessions. And we're not creedal. Baptists aren't creedal. Baptists don't like being told to sign stuff, especially Texas. We're ruggedly independent people, and we don't like being told by hierarchical people what to do. And I'm speaking more in general terms, obviously. Personally, I've read the 2000 Baptist Faith and Message and don't have a major issue with it. There's things that, like every confession that I've ever signed or have ever signed off on, I would reword or restate things to make them more clear or more compatible with the way I would believe. And I think that's true of every pastor or theologian who knows what they're talking about, because we know all confessions are made to be more ecumenical and to represent a wide body of people. And generally speaking, I don't have a problem with the 63 or the 2000 confession. And to assert this again, this is a to the man argument. Leighton must really believe that God doesn't have all knowledge. And if it wasn't for his confessions, he just wouldn't believe it. That is just an assertion on his part. Why even go there? It would be kind of like me saying, if you didn't have the London Baptist Confession of 1689 that said that you believe evangelism is necessary, then James White would have given up evangelism a long time ago. James White would have just thrown out evangelism altogether. I just know he would. How do I know? I just think I know everything about James White, and so I just assert he would be a hyper-Calvinist if the 1689 didn't preclude him from being one. Do you see how absurd that is and disrespectful? I can't come up with my own doctrinal views, and I don't have to adhere in my convention to the 2000 Baptist Faith and Message. So to assert that I'm only adhering to it because my convention would somehow throw me out if I didn't, it's just absurd.
I mean, I like Mike Winger. We've sat down. We sat down when I was over there before the world went insane, and I've obviously responded to just all sorts of stuff that he's said, and I think on certain topics demonstrated some fundamental exegetical issues that I don't believe the responses were adequate to correct. But anyway, we've had our back and forth, and he's going to say in this, I don't believe anything in determinism and stuff like that. And so we have a very different theodicy. Do I think that he can come up with a consistent theodicy? No, of course not. I don't. It's one of the reasons I'm Reformed. The biblical theodicy is the biblical theodicy, and it's based upon God's absolute sovereignty. There's no question about that.
Of course, what Calvinists mean by absolute sovereignty is theistic determinism, which he doesn't refute. I mean, he knows that's what it is. Of course, sovereignty doesn't mean determinism. Sovereignty means God's kingly right to rule as he pleases. God sits in heavens and does what he pleases. But it also goes on to say in that same chapter, the heavenlies belong to the Father, but the earth he has given over to man, which is why we pray, God, let your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven. A prayer that would be superfluous if God's will is always meticulously done, as the Calvinist deterministic worldview asserts. And so we're pushing back on Calvinist redefinition of the word sovereignty to mean theistic determinism, i.e. God brings about all things in accordance with his divine decree, even men's evil choices and desires, even the rapist's desire to rape, even the molester's desire to molest, even the murderer's desire to murder. All of those came about by sovereign decree on Calvinism, which, again, don't take my word for it. You'll hear it from them as we go through it.
So we answer the problem of evil very, very differently. And so we would debate atheists differently and all sorts of things like that. So that...
Yeah, and I'm hoping to have Mike on again towards the end of the month, and we may be talking about some of the methodological differences between the different worldviews. Your soteriology does drive your methodology. In other words, what you believe about God does affect the way you treat other people and the way you debate other people. I think this is manifest, especially during the Reformation times when you had people like Balthasar Hubmaier, who believed in religious liberty and the baptism of believers, not the baptism of infants. He was killed for that under the rule of Zwingli, by the way. And he believed we shouldn't kill dissenters, not only because he was one who was at scrutiny of being killed himself, but because he actually appealed to his soteriology. He appealed to God's patience and love. And he would make arguments to the effect of, instead of with we should try to persuade, instead of with sword and fire, with patience and prayer, because this is the model that Jesus gave us. He was patient with people, and because Christ died for all people, he went on to argue, we should give them as much time as possible. We shouldn't cut their life short. We should want their life to be long, so that they'll have as much time as possible to win them over. Balthasar Hubmaier argued. In other words, his soteriology drove the way he treated people. He wants to be patient with people who are dissenters of the faith. Instead of torturing them into the faith or burning them at the stake for disbelieving, he wants to be patient with them. He wants to show them love. Go figure. In other words, Balthasar Hubmaier sounds much more like a modern-day Baptist than does Luther or Calvin or Zwingli, and yet nobody knows hardly who Balthasar Hubmaier is. And I'm just saying, why don't we look to some of these heroes of the Christian faith who were burned at the stake along with their books and see maybe they were teaching a lot closer reality to what we believe today with regard to Christian liberty, with regard to how we should treat dissenters, with regard to how we should evangelize. And so, yeah, I do think that there is valid claims with regard to the methodology and how your soteriology or your theology will drive your methodology. Dustin, thank you for your super chat. This is typical James White. When he doesn't have an actual argument, he reaffirms his doctrine and misrepresentations and ad hominems. That's typical. I mean, that is unfortunately been the MO of Dr. White.
That's a problem. That's why we debate these things. But it even seems to me that in this discussion of open theism, when Pastor Winger asks Leighton Flowers, well, what if determinism was true? What if the Bible actually does teach it? What would you do then? And what you hear is Leighton does his...
Okay, well, we'll get to the question in a little bit, but that's not exactly what Mike asked. Mike asked, if determinism is true, would you believe that God is still, would you be able to say that God's still moral or right? And I have to think about that question for a while because I'm trying to be conciliatory towards people who listen who are Calvinist, because I want to be careful how I say these things. But I mean, thinking back over it, and I think what I was about to answer before Mike kind of redirects is much like what Roger Olson says to Horton, Dr. Horton, when they're talking about these things. And he makes the comment, he says, now, I'm not accusing Michael Horton, a Calvinist, of believing that God is monstrous. He says, what I'm saying is that if I were to conclude Calvinism's claim about God are true, then I logically would have to believe that God is monstrous, which is the reason that I reject that concept. Does that make sense? So it's the most conciliatory way of saying it. Wesley said something very similar in another quote that I've read before. I don't have it here. I would show it to you, but it's basically the concept and idea of one of the reasons we reject Calvinism is not only the exegetical commentary, which we spend hours on here going through why we don't exegetically believe determinism is supported in the scriptures, but we also don't believe it is tenable. It's a livable, practical way of doing life. It's not palatable. In other words, you got to live like your choices matter. You got to live like your choices are free in order for your life to have meaning and purpose. And so it's not only tenable, it's illogical, and therefore we reject it for those reasons. And so Mike is asking me, he's kind of asking me to consider, okay, if we find out determinism is true, would it be logically consistent for you to still claim that God is good? And that's where I was really pressed to kind of go, well, for all practical purposes, I would have to say, like Roger Olson said, that if I was going to be logically consistent, I would have to conclude that therefore God is evil. And this is the whole thing. When it comes down to these arguments, and we've made this point before, and we use the example, for example, if somebody came along and says, Jesus is a bigot, like the guy on TikTok recently, that weird pastor dude that pastor, I put in air quotes there, who comes out and says Jesus was a bigot. He didn't love women really, and he didn't really treat women fairly. He had to repent of that kind of thing, right? And so you got people come out and say Jesus is a bigot, right? Now there's three ways that you could deal with that kind of statement. You could either come along and say, well, yeah, Jesus was a bigot, but because he's Jesus, it's okay because Jesus is God and whatever Jesus does is right. And so, yeah, he was a bigot, but because it's Jesus, it's okay for him to be a bigot. You could come at that argument, okay? You could come at the argument and say, oh, Jesus was a bigot, therefore Jesus wasn't God, and I shouldn't worship him, and he's a bad person. So you could either come to that conclusion, which is probably what an atheist might do, is if he were to hear that. He would say, oh yeah, Jesus was a bigot, and I want to reject Jesus now, okay? Or the third argument is to say Jesus wasn't a bigot, which is most of us, right? We would say, no, Jesus is not a bigot. That's just wrong. Jesus is good, and he's not a bigot, right? So that's the three ways to approach that false claim about Jesus. Well, in the same way, you can have a false claim about God. You could say God decrees all moral evil, okay? And you could either take the Calvinist approach and say, yes, that's true, God does do that, but he's God and he can do what he wants, and therefore it's right. And so he does wrong things seemingly to us, but he's really right in doing it, and it's just a mystery beyond our full comprehension. We don't know really how it's true, as John Calvin himself actually makes the argument, as we've read thousands of times here before, from John Calvin, how it was ordained by the foreknowledge and decree of God what man's future was, without God being implicated as an associate in the fault as the author and the approver of transgression, is a secret so much excelling the inside of the human mind that I'm not ashamed to confess ignorance. I daily so meditate on these mysteries of his judgments that curiosity to know anything more does not attract me. What's he saying? I don't know how God's good. I don't know how his character is right and good given determinism. I just don't know how it's true. But he's taking that first approach. He's accepting, yes, God decrees moral evil. And I don't know how that works, but it's just true. But he's still good because God's good and you can't call God bad. So he's doing seemingly bad things from our perspective, but we know he's good. And that's the approach they're taking. What the atheist is doing is they're also accepting this claim. God decrees moral bad stuff, and therefore I don't believe in God, or I don't worship God, one of the two. And that's obviously the bad approach. The rest of Christianity, what are we doing? The rest of Christianity is doing the same thing whenever the person says Jesus was a bigot. We're coming along and saying, no, Jesus wasn't a bigot. Or we're doing the same thing. When people say God decrees moral evil, we're coming along and go, no, you're wrong. You misinterpreted the Bible. God doesn't decree moral evil. So you can choose which of those three methodologies you want to take when confronted with what people are saying about God. You can either say, yes, that's true about God, but he's still good and we just don't know how he's good. Or you can do what the atheist says and says, oh, God is decreeing more evil, therefore he's bad, and so we're going to reject God. Or you can come along with the rest of us and say God doesn't decree moral evil. You've got to decide which of those three approaches you're wanting to take, because that's really where it gets down to your theodicy, as we're talking about.
Well, I do whatever I was determined to do. Leighton, honestly, I think some people think that every time that Leighton Flowers does I've been determined to not understand these things, that he's just trying to be funny. No, that is how he thinks. It's
not how I think. It's what you believe. And prove me wrong, Dr. White. Prove me wrong. Come on the program and say, I do not believe that Leighton was determined to believe what he believes. Come out and just say that. Because otherwise, you're not mocking me. You're mocking the true claim of your system. Now, lest you just think that I'm misrepresenting Calvinist. Remember, James White touted the book by Bignon, the French philosopher. He touted his book as a defense of determinism, right? You've heard him on his program. You've seen it all over social media, this French philosopher, Bignon, being touted as one of the leading scholars in defense of this concept of theistic determinism. And let's just, instead of believing me, listen to what one of their leading scholars says with regard to what Leighton has been determined to believe and think. Okay, listen.
Exhaustively describe reality. So determinism isn't the thesis that some things are determined. It's the view that all things are determined. And we'll get back to that because that matters in some of the formulation of the arguments.
Okay, well this raises a question then. So did God causally determine Calvinists like Kokel, Christ, Muller, etc. to disagree with you?
The answer is yes. All things are determined. So yes, God did cause it.
Okay, so the Calvinists that disagree with theistic determinism, in other words, there are some Calvinists who believe in libertarian free will, like Crisp and others, inconsistently, but they do. They deny theistic determinism, and they disagree with the higher Calvinists who do believe in theistic determinism. And he asked them, did God determine them to do that? And he says, yes, that's exactly what happens. All right.
Determine that.
Okay. Okay, and it also raises another question. Leighton, you and
Yeah.
I both used to be Calvinists. They say, right? They claim to be Calvinists back.
Yeah, yeah. That's fine. And I can take that as their word. I didn't know them. I don't have any reason to doubt that they were sincere Calvinists in the past. But yes, to answer that question again, he's asking. Well, that raises a big question, a conundrum somehow for the Calvinists. Did God determine us to leave Calvinism? And yes, I take them at their word. I say yes, God determined that too. Determinism means all is determined. So just get this out of the way. Determinism means that everything is determined.
So it makes no sense to ask, well, did God determine that? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
The answer is yes.
Okay, so not from me. That's from the leading scholar of the Calvinistic system. God is determined for Leighton Flowers to leave determinism and to believe what I believe. So he's laughing at and mocking what he himself believes and his leading scholars teach and believe. The namesake for their own systematic even believes these things. Let me pull it up on the screen if we have time to do this real quick. I know many of you have seen these things. There's nothing new here under the sun from what we've done, but I just have to point these things out because new people are tuning in every time we have a program, especially when we're answering someone like James White. Creatures are so governed, according to John Calvin, by the secret counsel of God that nothing happens but what he has knowingly and willingly decreed. In other words, God decreed Leighton's view against determinism, period. That's just a truism of their view. He's mocking it. He's mocking me saying something that's true about his system. Just keep that in mind. John Calvin, quote, "We hold that God is the disposer and ruler of all things, that from the remotest eternity, according to his own wisdom, he decreed what he was to do, and now by his power execute what he decreed. Hence, we maintain that by his providence, not heaven and earth and inanimate creatures only, but also the counsels and wills of men are so governed as to move exactly in the course which he has destined." In other words, he has destined the will of men, the will to do good or to do evil, to molest, to rape, to do all those things. That is in accordance with his divine will. Thieves, murderers, rapists, molesters, everything. According to John Calvin, quote, "Other evildoers are instruments of divine providence, being employed by the Lord himself to execute judgments which he is resolved to inflict." Now, again, maybe this is not the James White kind of Calvinism. Maybe James White has softened John Calvin's Calvinism, or Bignon, maybe he's overstating his case. Maybe God doesn't really decree and determine for molesters to molest or rapists to rape on James White's form of Calvinism. Well, let's see.
When a child is raped, is God responsible, and did he decree that rape?
If he didn't, then that rape is an element of meaningless evil that has no purpose. What I'm trying to point out by going to Scripture...
So what is your answer there? Because I want to understand the answer to that question.
I'm trying to go to Scripture to answer.
Yes, but what is the answer to the question that he just asked so that we can understand what the answer is?
I mentioned to him, yes, because if not, then it's meaningless and purposeless, and though God knew it was going to happen, he created without a purpose. That means God brought the evil into existence. No, it was going to exist, but for no purpose, no redemption, nothing positive, nothing good.
So he did decree it, and if he decreed it, then there's meaning to it.
It has meaning, it has purpose.
Got it.
Suffering, all suffering has purpose. Everything in this world has purpose. There is no basis for despair. But if we believe that God created knowing all this was going to happen, but with no decree, he just created, and all this evil's out there and there's no purpose, then every rape, every situation like that is nothing but purposeless evil, and God is responsible for the creation of despair. And that is not what I believe.
For years I've been trying to figure out why it is that in order for rape to exist, or unless God caused it to happen, there can't be any purpose in it. God can use evil, and he does. But to blame God, which is what a decree does, to blame God for the rape of a child is a horrible attack on the very character and the love of God.
Okay, so you heard it for yourself. James White and Calvinism qua Calvinism, according to the namesake and the leading proponents, believe God determines all desires of evil, all moral evil, all heinous evil. That is the claim of their system, period. So when somebody asks me, Leighton, why did you determine this? And I say, if Calvinism is true, the reason I determine this is because God determined for me to, and you laugh at it and you mock it, then what are you mocking except the claim of your own system? You're ultimately calling determinism a joke. That's what you're doing. Whether you recognize you're doing it or not, you're mocking your own view. This is why I often say sometimes some arguments don't need to be refuted. They just need to be clearly stated, because intuitively we know they're funny. We know they're jokes. They're silly. They're untenable. That's the reason I keep stating them. I keep stating what you find to be so detestable and so weird and oh my goodness, that's so good. Why do I state it? Because it's the claim of your system, and it's revealing it how asinine it is. And whenever I state it and you laugh at it, instead of doing what Bing-Yang did, which is, well, yeah, that's true. Let's just move past that now because, yeah, that's true. Why don't all Calvinists just respond the way Bing-Yang did and just say, yes, it's true. You rejected Calvinism and you started a podcast because God determined for you to. Okay? And then we can talk about why you think God might do that. And you can also talk about why you think I'm still blameworthy for my actions in doing this when God determined for me to do it. And we can talk about that. And I think that would be a reasonable discussion then versus what I think we see James White doing here, mocking his own system.
Fundamental response. I think most people sit back and go, oh, stop clowning around and actually. No, he's not clowning around. That's as far as he can go.
Well, no, it's not as far as I can go. I also exegetically refute the verses that you use to support determinism, like Ephesians 1:11, that is a present active, God working out all things presently actively, versus him fixing something in eternity past and determining the destinies of men's desires, thoughts, actions, and beliefs. And I go through those exegetically. So I have much more than just my retort of, God determined for me to be an anti-determinist. I have much more than that. I have many more exegetical commentary on every single verse that you've ever brought up in defense of determinism. And so to say that that's all I have is obviously just demonstrably false.
He has nothing more than that. And that's frightening. Because, I find it a childish response. But for...
Okay, so to restate what determinism believes is childish. Okay, so determinism is childish. That's what. How else am I supposed to take that? If I say a truism, if I state a true fact about your belief system, was Bing-Yang being childish because he stated the same thing I said it? Why is it childish? Why is it childish to restate to you what you believe is true? And when I'm asked the question, if determinism is true, then why did you decide to do this? And I state, well, because God determined for me to. How is that humorous and childish if it's true on your system? It's just a truism.
For him, it is the best response you can come up with as well. I was predetermined not to be a Calvinist. That's why I'm not a Calvinist. And so the whole idea being his fundamental presuppositions are two. Man must be sovereign. God cannot be sovereign.
So man must be sovereign? Remember, sovereign for the Calvinist means deterministic. So is he trying to say that I believe that man must determine everything? What does that even mean? Of course God's sovereign. Free will's not a superpower. Just because God gives us a range of possible choices that we're able to make in our finite reality doesn't make God less sovereign. Makes him more sovereign because he doesn't have to play both sides of the chessboard in order to ensure his victory. He can actually beat real opponents in chess because he's better at them at chess. He doesn't have to control both sides of the board in order to ensure a victory. That's a very low view of sovereignty. Our view of sovereignty is much higher than the deterministic view of sovereignty.
Man must possess what God does not have. Just sit back and listen to the man speak. And
something you won't do. Sit back and listen to me speak. have a conversation with me. Come on to my program, which I've invited you to do, standing invitation, or I'll come on to yours if you feel more comfortable that way. Sit back and listen, actually listen to what I say, instead of putting arguments in my mouth like he would be an open theist if the Baptist Faith and Message would allow it, or he actually believes man is sovereign, not God. Do I ever say anything like that? Of course not. So instead of actually listening to what I say, what does he do? He puts words in my mouth, and then he attacks the straw man that he just created.
This is where he's coming from. This is his fundamental assertion, is that you have to have libertarian freedom on man's part, but God cannot have libertarian freedom. He's given it up voluntarily, but he cannot have libertarian freedom in...
God can't have libertarian freedom? Is that what I'm saying? Of course. I've heard Calvinists argue that God doesn't have libertarian freedom, but I'm certainly not arguing that God doesn't have libertarian freedom. I believe that God, like A.W. Tozer argues, God decreed not which choice man would make, but that man would have a free choice, and that a God less than sovereign wouldn't be willing to grant his creatures that amount of freedom. He wouldn't be able to handle it.
Creating a world that glorifies him in the way that he chooses to be glorified. He cannot work all things after the counsel of his will. That has to be limited.
No, he can work all things out of the counsel of his will. He's working things that we do freely according to the counsel of his will. There's a big difference between positively, actively, in time, working out things for good versus determining everything everybody does. Big difference between those two. And I love to use John MacArthur's words from whenever he was younger. He's become more and more Calvinistic over the years. But this is an article he wrote years and years ago that I love to use because it's it perfectly, succinctly describes what we believe with regard to like Romans 8:28, for example. But God's role with regard to evil is never as its author. God simply permits evil agents to work and then overrules evil for his own wise and holy ends. Amen. Agree with you there, MacArthur. Ultimately, God is able to make all things, including all the fruits of all the evil of all time, work together for a greater good. In other words, he is able to bring good from evil. It's called redemption. You take a bad thing that an autonomous, separate creature does, and you turn it for a good purpose. I don't have to cause the molester to molest through a divine decree in order to accomplish my purpose. God's big enough to accomplish his purpose despite, and sometimes when he chooses to, through the evil purposes of creatures. That is a correct theodicy. That is a biblical theodicy, and it doesn't undermine the holiness and the goodness and the character of God, which is what we're striving to do with our particular worldview, obviously.
That has to be a very narrow spectrum of things. And so it's presuppositional to everything else. And so that whole, well, I was predetermined not to believe in Calvinism, that's just simply a really bad, non-reflective, non-communicative way of saying, I reject the idea that God can be sovereign and yet anything man does have meaning.
Okay. Well, in some way, he's right in that me stating a truth about your view, in other words, me restating determinism, i.e. God determined for what I believe is true, he's saying that ultimately equals me saying that determinism undermines human responsibility. And that's true. That's what that statement is trying to reveal, how absurd it is, how asinine it is to hold people accountable for something that God determines. And that's why I point these things out. You're mocking your own system. You're not mocking Leighton's belief. You're mocking your own beliefs. When I say things like that, I am actually stating something that is factually true about your doctrinal worldview. By the way, Dr. Garza, thank you for your super chat. Al Garza, he's asking a question about an update on the possible debate between Dr. Wilson and Dr. White. I have no idea. I told those two I didn't want to get between them, and so I gave each of them the email addresses, and last I heard they were talking about it back in the day. I have no idea if that's been dropped. I don't know what's come of it. I would love to see it too, but I have nothing to do with it, just to let you know about that.
So my assertion is that man's meaningfulness can only be found in the denial of God's freedom to act as he chooses. So
and that's assuming that God can't freely choose to allow for creatures to have freedom and to make real choices that he himself doesn't determine. And that's what we're pushing back on. You can't assume that God can't do that.
We've talked about many, many times before, the conflation of the eternal and temporal, the flattening out of all things, ignoring that. That's why when you listen to that debate that he did on Unbelievable to Genesis 50, he just face plants. He has to. All of the texts in the Bible that present this full-orbed idea.
Full-orbed, and flattening out. This is his code language for mystery. He can't say mystery. He can't do what we heard John Calvin do in the quote I just presented, where he says, I've meditated on these things, I confess ignorance. He can't just come out and say, I confess ignorance, it's a mystery, I don't know how it works, like John Calvin does. He can't do that because he's mocked too many people over the years for appealing to mystery. So he can't do that. So what he has to do is use different code word language. And that is, you're flattening it out, i.e., you're stating our system plain and simple. Remember, the first time he ever accused me of flattening it out was when I actually superimposed his own scholar into my article and put his own scholar into my article, and he accused his own scholar of flattening it out. And all his scholar was doing exactly what Bing-Yang did. He's coming out and explaining determinism. God determines, decrees all things that come to pass. But that's just flattening it out. To actually state determinism plainly, that's just flattening out. What he means by orbed, multi-orbed, is you're willing to accept the seeming contradiction of God determining everything and man still being responsible. And if you just accept those two seemingly contradictions, that God is doing it, but you're still ultimately blamed for doing it, then if you're not willing to accept that, then you just don't have a multi-orbed, i.e. you're not willing to accept this apparent contradiction. You're not willing to accept this irrational claim with regard to who God is and what he believes.
He can't deal with them. That's been shown over and over and over again.
Of us in the middle, I don't know that we should be very more hard on one of them than the other. I think both of them we need to stand firmly against and say, this is why we don't agree with what your conclusions are.
So here's
see what I'm saying?
The others.
Okay, so apparently he has his earpiece in, and whenever Rich starts to play it, it blows out his eardrum. And so that's the reaction you're seeing from James White, is that I blew out his eardrum. But because of that, apparently he missed my sentence there, because what did I just say in that sentence? I just said I am treating both. The whole point of this little section here is saying I'm treating people I disagree with, whether they're open theists or they're determinists. I treat both of them as brothers, because ultimately I believe they're making a similar philosophical error. And again, there are many different kinds of Calvinists, and there are many different types of open theists. Okay, and I know that this is an oversimplification of that, because I know that there's, like we already acknowledged, there's Crisp, for example, who is Calvinistic in his soteriology, but doesn't affirm determinism, and he actually affirms libertarian free will. Okay, so like Kokel and others. Okay, so Calvinism has a big umbrella of folks underneath it that hold the differing views. Open theist, same kind of thing. Now, open theist has been dumbed down to this concept and idea of God just doesn't know the future at all and have any idea of the future, and he's just out there guessing, and that kind of thing is often the caricature. But most of the guys that are scholars among the best of the best arguments of the dynamic perspective don't argue that way. They sound a lot like Molinists, to be honest. I mean, there's a lot of the middle knowledge talk and all those kinds of things. I'm not trying to get into all that right now, okay? But I fundamentally disagree with the philosophical conclusion, the modal fallacy, as we've explained it through teachings from William Lane Craig, who is trained in philosophy, unlike myself, who talks about how you can't conflate the certainty with necessity, that something can be certainly known without being determined by the knower, right? Well, Calvinists have ultimately determined and decided that if God knows something prior to creating it, and he creates it anyway, then that means he has determined it. He is the one who is the author of it in a sense. He is the script writer of it, the as Chris Date even talks about, he's the Tolkien to the Lord of the Rings. I mean, he's the author of it. He's the one bringing this thing to pass by sovereign decree, and it's just the way that it has to be, because they can't imagine philosophically any other way for it to be. Okay, so if he knows it, then he must have necessitated, he must have determined it. And so the open theist deals with that by saying, well, that's true claim, and so we'll just come along and say, well, he doesn't know it. He doesn't have full knowledge of these things, and he doesn't have complete knowledge. And what our perspective says is, if there's going to be a mystery, this is where you appeal to the mystery, and that is in the quality of omniscience. Just like we appeal to mystery with the quality of omnipotence, his power, and we talk about this, the argument that Lennox makes between that and how. We don't know how God made something from nothing. His power. That's an appeal to mystery with the power of God. We don't know how he makes something from nothing. Can't possibly begin to describe that. It's beyond our full comprehension. But we believe that he made something from nothing, obviously. So you could believe that something's true without knowing how it's true. Well, omniscience is the same way. I don't know how God knows my choices tomorrow, but I believe that he knows my choices tomorrow. Okay? And that's where my mystery is. And I'm not afraid to appeal to mystery. Now, I could do the James White thing and say, oh, you're flattening it out because you believe determinism is the only answer. You don't have the full orbed concept and idea that God has the power to know the future free choices of people he doesn't determine. And I could do the same thing to him. And what am I doing? I'm appealing to a mystery. I don't know how God creates something from nothing. I don't know how he knows my choices before I make them. I believe that he does based upon revelation, and I do so in faith. And I'll leave it at that, because that's where the Bible leaves it. I'm a theologian, not a philosopher. I'll let the philosophers philosophize about why and how they think God pulls off these things, but I'm not going to throw somebody out of the kingdom because they come to a different philosophical conclusion about those things. That's why I just made the argument. I treat James White as a brother. I treat Brian Wagner as a brother. Brian Wagner has a dynamic perspective of the knowledge of God. James White has a deterministic perspective of the knowledge of God. Mike Winger has more of the perspective like I have with regard to more of the typical Boethian type of perspective of God outside of time. He takes more of that approach from what I understand from what he says. All three of them I treat as brothers, because all of them are attempting to answer a very deep, very difficult to understand philosophical problem. But what am I doing? I'm saying I think we should treat all three of them like brothers. That's my point. And I would think that James White would agree with that, because he has, quote unquote, brothers that he treats like brothers who are not Calvinists and who aren't determinists. I don't know for sure if he would deem all open theists as believers or not. I don't know where he stands on that. I can't imagine somebody throwing somebody out of the kingdom in the sense of saying, well, he must not be redeemed, if he lands on some philosophical dynamic perspective. It's just weird to me, and yet some Calvinists are that dogmatic about it, and it's strange.
Side of it, right? Open theism. If I understand, the way people often come to open theism is it's an attempt at theodicy, at a defense of why God allows evil, and basically the part that's open theism says, hey, well, he didn't even know that was going to happen.
Right.
You can't blame him because he didn't know. And I would say that doesn't mean anything to me, because in the middle of the evil thing God didn't know about, now he knows. Why doesn't he stop it right then?
Right.
Like, you still have to deal with God allowing these things to happen. And so it doesn't really solve anything. All it does is potentially strip God of an attribute the Bible declares that he has. Right. And I know open theists are gonna be like, Mike, you don't understand our position. You're misrepresenting us. Yeah. And I will say, I think, and I could be wrong here, but I mean that sincerely. My studies so far show me you don't understand your position if you're an open theist, and you say that. Right. It's not me. But look at like Greg Boyd and his stuff he says on open theism. I'm embarrassed to listen to what he says about it. I'd much rather hear a Calvinist talk about determinism, as far as what offends me more. Really? I'm embarrassed. He demonizes the Old Testament and demonizes a lot of the stuff that's in, and I'm going like, my goodness, are you an atheist? Like, what? This is what I hear from the atheists I deal with online. Now it's coming out of a Christian pastor.
Now remember,
and just real quick, Boyd's Boyd's view of the Old Testament is, I think, distinct from his concepts of open theism and the knowledge of God. So that's where I might just push back on Mike a little bit now, is to say you can't equate Boyd's specific views on the Old Testament with his view of God's knowledge, because someone like Brian Wagner, for example, would very likely disagree with some of Boyd's claims about the Old Testament, but still have a dynamic perspective of God's knowledge. And so I don't think you can equate those two. And I'm not sure Mike was meaning to do that, but it kind of came across that way. I just want to make that distinction.
And I'm not sure if the hearing will ever cover in that ear, but I can hear.
I wonder why God decreed for that to happen. Sorry, can't help it.
Hear it clearly. I could, at least at first. How'd you lose your hearing? Latent flowers. just latent flowers blew up my eardrum.
Or you were born totally depraved and you don't have the ability to hear because of a decree of God from birth. Spiritual deadness, right? Sorry.
Anyway, so we've got it working now. But notice what's being said there. Mike is saying, I reject this system. But what you're going to be hearing as part of this discussion is, which is more offensive? Calvinistic determinism or open theism? And
okay, which is more offensive? Now remember, this is two people are talking who believe both open theism is wrong and determinism is wrong. Okay, that's our starting premise. We believe both of them are wrong. Okay, so just step into our worldview for just a second and ask yourself this objectively. Ask yourself the question: if both open theism is wrong and determinism is wrong, let's just assume that for the sake of this argument, okay? Which is exactly what Mike Winger is going to have me do in a second, is pretend like determinism is correct and now answer a question with that in mind. Now, I'm asking you to do the same thing, James White and Calvinists that are watching. Step into our worldview for a second, okay? Assume open theism is wrong and assume determinism is wrong, okay? You there? Can we objectively do this? Okay, it's the mark of an educated mind to entertain a thought without accepting it. So just be educated with me for just a second. Work with me, okay? Put down your axe just for a moment. Work with me, brothers. Okay, let's assume both of them are incorrect. I know you believe determinism is correct. Okay, but let's pretend that it's not. Got it? We're all together now. I'm sounding patronizing. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know how to be more simple about this. Okay, if both of them are false, which one of them is worse objectively? Subjective, I mean, I know it sounds subjective, but I think objectively, which is worse? Saying God lacks an ability that we think he has, or saying that God lacks character that we think he has? Which is worse, undermining his character or his ability? I'm just objectively trying to consider, if somebody goes around and says his IQ is under 100, he's not that bright. He's not that smart. His abilities lack intelligence. He lacks intelligence. Versus if they're going around and say, Leighton lacks character. He hates his kids. He doesn't take care of his wife. He's stealing money. He's doing this. He's doing that. He's lacked character. Which one of those two things is going to offend me the most? Okay. Leighton Flowers can't run very fast. Leighton Flowers can't bench press very much. Versus Leighton Flowers hates his children and his wife. Which one of those two things is going to offend me more? Objectively, just ask yourself that question. Well, obviously, it's much more grievous to demean somebody's character than it is to demean their abilities. Now, I think both of them are demeaning, especially if you're lying about my ability to bench press or run faster or any of those other things, or my intelligence level. My IQ might be 130 and you're saying it's 90. And that may be false, but I'm going to be more offended, just me personally speaking. I'm going to be more offended about you demeaning my character than my abilities. That's just objective, okay? So if you're being objective Calvinist and you step away and you go, okay, what if I'm wrong here? What if my systematic is wrong? What if determinism isn't true? But I'm going around saying what we just heard James White say on the Bible Answer Man program in response to Bryson and say, yeah, God decrees the rape of babies for his own glory. Oh yeah, by the way, I found out that's wrong. God's not decreeing the rape of babies. What have I just done? I've just called good evil and evil good, the very thing the Bible says not to do. That's deplorable. Okay, I have blamed God for something He didn't do. Okay, again, you're assuming, and I know you have your defenses for why you believe those things. I understand why you have deterministic logic and philosophical, conclusions from exegesis of text that I think you've exegeted wrongly, and you think you've correctly done so. Okay, but I'm asking you to be objective for just a minute and just back out of it and say, what if I have misexegeted those texts? What if I've misinterpreted those passages, and I have blamed God for something that isn't true? Okay, what kind of grievous error have I made in comparison to what the open theist has made? That's the point I'm getting at. That's not, James White doesn't seem to even be able to entertain that concept. It doesn't seem to me, at least.
So it's fascinating that the theology that gave the form to the Protestant Reformation is now considered to be as offensive as literally denying that God knows the future.
Okay, so that's an appeal to authority. Okay, because these people that we highly esteem held to certain positions. Therefore, for him to even entertain the concept and idea that they might be wrong, we just can't do that. And that's part of the bias, is that I'm not even willing to entertain, what if I'm wrong here? What could be the grievous thing that I am doing if I am wrong? What could be the grievous thing that John Calvin and the other reformers that you speak of were doing if they were wrong? Instead of entertaining that, he just dismisses it on the basis of popularity, on the basis of authority, because these great men that we all hold in esteem held to it. And here, how dare he come along and even compare it to this newfound thing, instead of dealing with the actual point that we were talking about.
You make a good point. He seems to be trying to justify God by using his open theism to justify why these things happen theodicy-wise, but it really doesn't help his case any, for the reasons you already mentioned. And I agree with you. I think that there are mistakes that systematic is making, and the thing is, I guess I don't find them any more grievous than the mistakes that our deterministic brothers are making. I find them both equally as grievous.
Okay, catch that? So, for Leighton Flowers, the Westminster Confession of Faith, the Princeton scholars, Hodge, Warfield,
appeal to authority,
Charles Spurgeon, Calvin, Luther. Luther had a strong doctrine in this area. They are all just as offensive as open theism, which denies to God the capacity of knowing what free creatures will.
Truth is, I probably understated it. I mean, even in that clip, I was probably understating. I mean, if I'm being honest, if I'm honestly looking at both of those side by side and saying both of these are wrong, I would have to conclude that determinism is more grievous than open theism. I didn't state that clearly enough, I don't think. And so, if James White really wants to critique me, he should critique this video instead of that one, because I'm actually saying I think determinism is a more grievous error than that of open theists. I still find both of them to be a philosophical error for the reasons I've already stated. But if both of them, again, assuming both of them are incorrect, I think objectively speaking, determinism is more grievous.
Will do in the future. Remember, Dr. Sanders, and this was something that Idol Killer, that was the guy's name, Idol Killer.
He remembered your name. He was calling you God Killer earlier. There's a little difference between Idol Killer and God Killer, by the way, James White. And this is my gift from Warren McGrew.
You're just wasting my time. What are you talking about?
That's James White there.
It is a foreign religion.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Idol Killer. He didn't even need to make this video. I've already got all his responses right here. All right, move along. Thank you, Idol Killer.
This is something that Idol Killer never asked John Sanders, which I found really strange. But I asked Dr. Sanders in our first debate at Reformed Theological Seminary, did God know that you would exist when he created the universe? And his answer was no, of course not.
Now, I can't speak for all guys who open to open theism, dynamic omniscience. I know that some answer that question differently, just like some Calvinists answer different questions differently with regard to their particular brand of determinism or compatibilism or whatever it may be. So, again, anecdotal, evidence of things like this, I don't know that represents all forms of openists or open theist or dynamic omniscience views. I don't know. I honestly, there's part of me that doesn't. We may have some people. I'm working on getting some better representation from the dynamic perspective on. Maybe Brian will come back on, or I'll get Idol Killer. I know he's Warren may come back on and talk through some of these things. Again, a lot of philosophical stuff that's packed in to those issues, and a lot of it's beyond my my intelligence level, because I'm drooling on my keyboard as we speak, and so I barely can understand what James White's saying, much less what the deeper philosophical guys are saying.
No, of course not. So for Leighton Flowers, someone can literally state that God didn't know that Leighton Flowers was going to exist when God created, which means he didn't know any of the evil that Leighton Flowers would do in his life, or anyone in the generation before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, he made all the conditions for all of that to happen without it having any meaning, without it fulfilling anything.
Yeah, Aaron brings up a point, and he's asking the question: if on some forms of open theism, I would add that, because there's different forms of open theism, I'm sure. If God chooses not to know the future, in other words, if he limits his own knowledge, because in their view that may be necessary in order for him not to determine things, is for him to limit his own knowledge of the future, is that really an inability? And that's a good question. I would guess not. It's like the rock you can't move question. Can God create a rock so big that he can't move it? Well, that's a different question than can God create a rock that he chooses not to move? That's two completely different questions. And I would have to assume there's nothing logically impossible about God choosing to create a rock that he leaves untouched. In other words, he chooses not to move it at all. He does have that capacity. And so if the open theist, a brand of the open theism, is saying God could know the future free choices, but in order for them to be free, he had to limit his scope of knowledge in creation, which, by the way, that's not a lot different than the whole infralapsarian, supralapsarian, sublapsarian controversy. If you go back and because it's talking about, what is it? The order of God's decrees. God decrees this and then this. God decrees the fall and then redemption, versus, all these. What are they doing? They're trying to get to this exact issue with regard to God's knowledge and the causal link between God's knowledge in a temporal, linear world of time and space. Our brains can't get this. That's why I always go to the that versus how. And you just recognize there is mystery here. But you got to go with what the scripture says. And the scriptures don't ever say that God determines and decrees evil. In fact, you've got a lot of verses that fly in the face of that, denying that he decreed them to kill their children to Molech, for example, as in Jeremiah 19:5. That pride and lust are not from the Father, but from the world. He doesn't even tempt men to do evil. All these passages of Scripture which scream at us saying God is holy, he is separate from that which is evil, and then therefore to conclude based upon a philosophical quandary that God must decree evil based upon your understanding and idea of how time and space works within the infinite concept of who God is and how he works within time and space. I don't know. I don't know why people would ever be so dogmatic as to claim some of the things they claim philosophically, but they do.
That is what open theism is. But to say that God is working all things after the counsel of his will.
Okay. We believe God works all things after the counsel of his will. But working an evil choice of a bad person for a good purpose, redeeming it, like we read from MacArthur even earlier from his commentary on Romans 8:28, that's much different than God decreeing all things, sovereignly and unchangeably decreeing the desires, the lusts, the pride of men. There's a big difference between those two things. And that's why sometimes if he gets the chance to paint his worldview with kind of political speech to make it sound really nice and comfortable, then yeah, it sounds better than this other perspective over here that God just doesn't know anything, versus the I think the more nuanced reality that would be brought by a scholar from that perspective. And of course, James White's not going to take time to paint the other worldview with the steel manning best responses. he's going to demonize it and make it sound as ridiculous as possible, while making his own view sound as palatable and nice and sugar-coated as possible.
That he has predestined all things, summing up all things in Christ, that's equally offensive to the assertion that God didn't know that latent flowers even exist when he created them.
I think they're both misinterpreting the text. I think they're both misinterpreting. I think they both come at it with a bad philosophy to begin with, in order to come to conclusions. But because one of them's newer or just now being more popularized doesn't make it more likely to damn you to hell. You know what I'm saying? If that makes sense. They're both of them are making mistakes that I think.
And I get what you're getting at, because you're like, you see Calvinism as at its core really compromising God's very character. And
now, notice my point there, that what I'm saying again is the whole point of this discussion is combating Calvinists who are trying to throw open theists out of the kingdom by saying that if you're an open theist, then you must not be really a Christian. You must not really be a believer. You must not be a brother. That's what we were confronting here. That's what we were talking about. James White doesn't even really address that point, it seems. He seems to only be concerned with the fact that I'm offended I disagree with both of them, and I believe that I can still treat them both as brothers. And he wants to focus upon the fact that I find both views reprehensible, in the fact that I don't agree with either view. But I would even come out even stronger than I did in this first video to say I actually believe that determinism, the claims of the deterministic system, if it is wrong, is objectively more grievous than the mistake that our open theist friends would be making.
Here's my question for you, right? Okay. If Calvinism's wrong, then it may very well at its core compromise God's very character because of the deterministic system. But let's just hypothetically say if Calvinism was true, if total determinism was true, would you conclude that there was something wrong in the character of God?
If God determined me to, yeah.
No,
now, I hate when I do that. Now, is that true on Calvinism? Is that true? Yes, that's true. In other words, how do I come to a decision? If determinism, unilateral determinism is true, how do I come to my decision with regard to what I believe about the character of God? Because an atheist very likely believes that the God of the Bible is a deterministic God, and therefore he, based on that, rejects God. And why? Because God determined him to, if determinism is true. That's just a fact of the matter. So when you laugh at that, you're laughing at your own worldview if you're a determinist. Okay. So if determinism is true, let's just pretend determinism is true.
Yeah, which I am 100% on board with you. It's not true. Yeah, it's not accurate. I don't
again,
believe
my brain is trying.
Okay, so I actually skipped over a little bit here that I wanted to get him. I wanted to get him commenting on this, and I missed it on.
You know what I mean? Like,
see what I mean? That's not an answer, and Mike Winger knows that's not an answer. But I think that's about the only answer that Leighton has, because he doesn't give anything better as he goes along.
Well, that's true, though. I mean, if you think if determinism is true, then I'm only going to do what God determined me to do. And so
I mean, would you be logically consistent if you concluded that God is therefore somehow morally compromised because of determinism?
Okay. So if determinism is true, let's just pretend determinism is true.
Yeah, which I am 100% on board with you. It's not true. Yeah, it's not accurate. I don't
again,
believe
my brain is trying to work around this, because obviously if determinism is true, I'm only going to determine what God has determined for me to determine. But
see, that's all he's got.
Okay. It's the claim of your system. I'm just stating the claim of your system, because he's asking me why would I do this? Well, the ultimate reason why I would determine my choice would be on determinism is because God determined it. That's just a fact of the matter. Now what he's trying to get me to answer is, could I logically conclude that while determinism is true, God is still morally good? That's what he's trying to get me to conclude, which I already reflected on earlier with regard to Roger Olson's perspective, that if I came to the conclusion that the Calvinism's version of determinism is true, I would have to conclude, as Roger Olson said, that God is monstrous, that God is immoral under that view. Logically, I would have to come to that conclusion because that's the logic of it. Now, I could deny logic. In other words, I could say, well, it doesn't matter what my logic says. I'm gonna just deny logic. I'm just going to accept the antinomy. I'm going to accept the paradox. I'm going to accept the very quote that we gave from John Calvin. I'm just going to stop meditating on it and just accept the multi-orbed perspective. God determines pride, lust, and molestations, but God is good, and just accept it. The three quandaries of Jesus is a bigot, but because Jesus is a bigot, it's Jesus, and Jesus is the one who defines what's good and bad, and so you can't call him bad. So yeah, he's a bigot, but he's still good, and we just don't understand how he can be a good bigot. But he's a married bachelor, or whatever it is. It's just this logical contradiction. Instead of just going, no, Jesus isn't a bigot, okay? God determines evil, but he's good. God decrees evil, all moral evil, but he's still good. And we just accept it, and if you don't accept it, then you don't accept our moral order. And instead of just going in and go, no, God doesn't decree moral evil. You've got that wrong. And that's what we're trying to push back on. That's why we're having this discussion.
That is honestly, a lot of people think it's just a joke because it is a joke. But no, that is...
Determinism is a joke. Correct. Mark it down, ladies and gentlemen. Mark the time and the date. He just called determinism a joke. Just so you know.
Where he is.
But the question's not what would you think if determinism was happening to you right now.
No,
instead, it's
asking,
a thought experiment, right?
Right. You're asking instead, would it therefore make God's character, would it impugn God's character if determinism is true?
Are you okay with the conclusion that God is morally wrong? That's where I go. I cannot go there.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't. I mean, if I said the same thing about open theism, I would say the same thing. I mean, if open theism is true, I'd have to come to the conclusion that if it's true, it's true, and God's not morally evil. I mean, if you come to the Scripture with any presupposition, you come with a presupposition that God's good, that He's always just and He's always right, and therefore, if determinism is correct and God is always just.
By the way, can I just point something out to you? God determines what is just and right. God's revelation determines that. If you as a human being create a standard of goodness and rightness and then demand God to live up to it, who are you making yourself to be? So the presupposition that Leighton has is that we can come up with these things on our own. So why did Abraham tie Isaac to the altar? I mean, there's so many places where that, again, man-centeredness, and I will not apologize for continuing to point out when he announces it over and over and over again, the man-centeredness of this provisionism. But
yeah, we agree. It's centered on the man Jesus Christ because it's a Christocentric soteriology. In other words, God reveals himself through the person of Jesus Christ by not controlling his enemies, but dying for his enemies. He lays down his life, provides for his enemies. He doesn't pass by on the other side of the road like the priest and the Levite. He stops and helps his enemies. And if they deny his help, then that's their fault, not his. And to kind of go with what he was talking about there with regard to the morality of God. And again, it's just like the Jesus is a bigot thing, right? His approach to say, well, yeah, but Jesus is the determiner of right and wrong. And so even if Jesus did something that's bigoted, then we just say that he's a good bigot. Okay, he's a good thief. He's good at it. He's good, but while doing something that we know intuitively is evil, and we just accept it as evil. And if you don't accept it, then you must just not accept the multi-orbed world that we live in. And so we're just going, no, Jesus isn't a bigot. No, God doesn't determine rapes for his glory. Okay, so we're denying the claim of your system. And this is where I think that the quote from C.S. Lewis is so apropos. I mean, this applies perfectly because what is he confronting here? He's confronting Calvinism in this quote. And listen to what C.S. Lewis says. If God's moral judgment differs from ours so that our black may be his white, we can mean nothing by calling him good. For to say God is good while asserting that his goodness is wholly other than ours is really only to say God is we know not what. And an utterly unknown quality in God cannot give us moral grounds for loving or obeying him. If he is not in our sense good, we shall obey, if at all, only through fear, and should be equally ready to obey an all-powerful demon. That's what omnipotent fiend means. All-powerful demon. The doctrine of total depravity, when the consequence is drawn that, since we are totally depraved, our idea of God is worth simply nothing, may thus turn Christianity into a form of devil worship. And what is he talking about? He's saying that when people come along and blame God for doing devil-like things, but then say we should worship him anyway because even though it looks like a devilish thing, he still must be good, and that's just a quandary we can't understand in our multi-old world, but we're going to worship this seemingly morally evil person. And we're going, no. God is demonstrably good. What does demonstrably mean? It's able to be demonstrated why he's good. This is one of the reasons I wrote the book, God's Provision for All. This is what I start with the illustration of my grandfather. And this is why I get into this. And this is why, so please hear me. This is very vital to understand this. I talk about my grandfather because my grandfather, he went to be with the Lord probably 10, 11, 12 years ago. It's been a while. It's been a long time, probably longer than that. And he was a demonstrably good man. In other words, he did good for others. He was always stopping on the side of the road and helping. He could build anything. He was a machinist in the World War II. He could fix any engine. And when he couldn't fix an engine, it was not a unusual thing for him just to give somebody an engine. Just like, oh, I can't fix your boat. Well, you can have mine. Literally, that's the kinds of things that my grandfather would do. He was just a very giving, very humble, very gracious man that would very rarely pass by anybody who needed help and not help them. And that's just the way he was. And when I was at his funeral, people would just keep coming up to us as the family, and they would say, your grandfather, Rusty Russell, you call him Rusty Bucket, was his handle on the CB and everything. Everybody call him Rusty. Well, Rusty was such a good man. And they weren't just giving a platitude. Like a lot of times you'll hear platitudes at a funeral because that's just what you're supposed to say to the family. Oh, your father was just a good man. And when really he was a jerk and never helped anybody. And they would just, oh, he's going to be missed. When they're thinking in the back of their mind, man, I'm not going to miss that guy. That's not the way this was. It wasn't platitudes. They would come up to me and they would say, Rusty was such a good man. And then they would tell me a story. What were they doing? They were demonstrating his goodness. They would say, when I was in need, here's what he did for me. When I had problems, here's what he did for me. He had that kind of character. My mother tells me a story about when they were younger. They had gone on vacation, and their house burned down. Electrical wiring or something happened, and their house just burnt. Everything in their house lost completely to the ground. And the neighborhood and the people in the city, in the town where my grandfather was known at the time, heard about Rusty Bucket. I get emotional thinking about my grandpa. He meant a lot to me. And people, they had insurance to cover their house being rebuilt, but they didn't have insurance to cover the possessions. So that they literally got a new house, but nothing to put in it. No dishes. My mom didn't have any dolls. No beds to sleep on. They had nothing. And literally, just as a blue-collar worker, he just didn't have money. And so they had this empty house that the insurance paid for without anything in it. And the neighborhood began to hear about this. And they just began to return the things that he had given away. Gosh, why do I get so emotional? I don't know. Be a man, Leighton. Yeah, swallow your emotions, right? They just began to return the things that he had given to them, and oftentimes bringing a little extra to help fill their house up. And he lived by the principle, everything not given is lost, because that was true, especially that story. Everything he hadn't given out of his house literally was lost in the fire. It's true of our souls, by the way. Everything you don't give is lost, including your very life. And my grandfather lived his life with that. He gave, and he gave. And helping others in need, he demonstrably, you can demonstrate his goodness. How? By showing what he did for others. Okay? So if I give a defense, an apologetic for the goodness of my grandfather, how am I going to do that? I'm going to walk through and show you how my grandfather did good things for people and had good intentions towards people, not bad intentions, right? Okay, in the same way, if I'm going to give an apologetic for God and his goodness, what am I going to do? I'm going to demonstrate for you his goodness. And when somebody brings a false accusation about my God and says, God does this, this, and this evil thing, and some atheist yells, God determines all evil. He just likes rapists to rape and blah, 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 blah. What am I going to do? I'm going to, no, that is not my God. My God doesn't do that. My God actually helps people in need. He redeems all the evil. He actually is going to hold people accountable who do those horrible things. Nobody's going to be mocked. God's not going to be mocked. A man's going to reap what he sows. It may look like he's gotten away with that. He's not gotten away with anything. God is just. He's good. He's right. And I'm going to defend God just like I would defend my grandfather by demonstrating his goodness, not by agreeing with my accuser and saying, oh, yeah, you're right. My grandfather actually caused all of this evil, did all these evil things. He actually started the fire and was the fireman, but he's good and you just don't understand my grandfather because you're not multi-orbed enough. No, I'm going to defend my grandfather by demonstrating his goodness. In the same way, I'm going to demonstrate how my God is good by going to the scriptures and pointing out how you've misinterpreted passages to mean things that they don't mean. And that's how I'm going to defend it, because my father is good. Much better than my grandfather ever hoped to be. The reason my grandfather had any level of goodness was because of his relationship with Jesus Christ and what Christ had taught him to do.
That's a presupposition, whether he wants to see it or not.
Always right, then somehow what J.I. Packard and others say, it's an antinomy. You just don't get it, Leighton, but somehow God's completely deterministic and he's not culpable, and you're just too dumb to get it, because God apparently determined for you to be too dumb to get it. That's just the way that it is. And on the other side, if open theism is true, and we again come to the presupposition God's good and he's just and he's right, then I would still conclude that, okay, God doesn't know near as much as we thought he did know, but he's still good and just as right. And so you see what I'm saying? I think either way.
Yeah, and I agree with you there. I think that's it. To me, I go, I cannot entertain the idea, and I don't mean like emotionally, but I mean intellectually, I can't sustain the concept that Almighty God has some sort of moral flaw. And even if the world looked 100% like God somehow must be doing something wrong here, I would have to conclude I'm obviously wrong. Yeah. Like, God is God. And here the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I go, oh, Lord, I trust you. I don't understand it. And I wouldn't even have a defense. If someone asked me, my defense would be, God's good because he's God. And I will not let the circumstances of this time convince me that he's not good. So I tend not to use that concept of, like, some people say the Calvinistic God, and he is therefore like a bad God. And I go, you are treading on, in my mind, or treading on dangerous ground when you make statements like that. So I would say I can,
which Leighton has made 144,000 times.
Understand how.
So you should be able to maybe give us an example of some of those things when I've called it a Calvinistic God. That the whole defense of this is that Calvinists are my brothers and worship the same God I do. They're misinterpreting things about God and drawing wrong conclusions about God. Okay? And so, again, James White makes an accusation without any citation. I don't say that Calvinists are worshiping another God. I actually call people out for saying that Calvinists believe in a false God. And what we're arguing is that you believe in the same God we do, but you've misinterpreted some passages of Scripture, and you've used false philosophy, bad philosophy, to conclude things about God that aren't true. That's been my argument all along. Now, there are a lot of people on the side chat and who follow the broadcast who would like for me to come right out and say you worship a false God and that you're not a true believer and you're going to hell. But that's the very thing I'm defending against on this program, which you don't seem to want to acknowledge.
A deterministic God would make it very difficult to have a theodicy or to deal with the problem of evil. I don't know how I have a video on the problem of evil. I don't know exactly how I would make that video if I believed in determinism.
Right.
So I'm thankful that that's not the case.
So there you go. Obviously, we have dealt many times with Pastor Winger on theodicy, and I think have provided some strong arguments. But the point is, when you can take open theism with its incredibly damaging, unbiblical, philosophical underpinnings, and even begin to compare it to the theology that broke the Roman stranglehold on Europe. I mean, maybe you disagree with Luther, but Luther said this is the issue. Will of man, sovereignty of God. That's what.
Well, and Luther's views on the subject were quite a bit different, as pointed out in another episode, than what John Calvin's were on some of those issues. But that notwithstanding, the damaging theology of open theism, as you put it, was decreed by God on your system for His glory, and yet you're bemoaning it. So you're bemoaning that which you believe God has sovereignly and unchangeably brought to pass for His glory. Explain the rationality of that, please. Again, you will mock me for saying that, but when you do so, you're mocking a truism of your belief system, because on your belief system, God brought to pass all things, which would include the damage of open theism. So explain to me rationally why it is okay for you to stand up against what you believe God has sovereignly and unchangeably determined for His own self-glorification. When you can do that, maybe we can have a rational discussion about this.
But that's what he was right. He was right. But a lot of most open theism does not have any meaningful connection to the history of the church as far as there being any kind of consistency in belief. Did you?
When Mike posed that question to Leighton, and Leighton kind of laughed it off, and then Mike pressed him on it, and like, no, we need to talk about this. Do you think that he was sincere?
Who?
In Leighton? In suddenly, it was like he'd never ever actually considered that as a possibility.
Well, no, I really honestly think that there's a loop in the man's mind where if you say God is sovereign over all things, He simply will not allow for there.
Now, what he means by God's sovereign over all things, which is something we would all affirm, he means God determines all things, which would include my beliefs. Keep that in mind, okay? Because that's where the irrationality of his statement lands and what he's mocking me for. It's one of the reasons you get hung up with questions like, okay, assuming determinism is true, why would you make that choice? Why would you believe this? Would you believe it's logically consistent to still call God morally just and right if you believe that God determines and controls the molester's desires and decisions to molest? That kind of question, of course, has come to my mind. Like I said with the Roger Olson quote, Roger Olson, would have to conclude, if determinism is true, now that I understand the claims of the system and I don't have a cognitive dissonance that I once had as an affirming Calvinist at one time, once I see the two and how they relate, I have to conclude, logically, it would be inconsistent for me to hold to determinism while still declaring that God is moral. Now, I believe that Calvinists are sincere in their affirmation of God being a good God. Okay, that's what I've said before. But I think it's logically inconsistent for them to do so. They appeal to mystery as to how God can be good while still determining evil. Whereas I say God doesn't determine evil. Not in the way that they suggest, anyway.
To be the distinction that Christian theology makes between the decree of God and the prescriptive will of God. And so
the decree of God, i.e. God's determinism versus what He says. So that's the two wills of God. This is what God's determined. This is what God says. God says, I didn't decree for you to burn your children in Molech, but I sovereignly decreed unchangeably in eternity past for you to kill your children in Molech. And if you don't accept both of those statements as true, though contradictory, by any objective person's reality, if you don't accept both of those things to be true, then you just don't accept the multi-orbed mystery, air quotes, of our worldview. And he's right about that. I don't think it's rational to call a man a married bachelor. To call them a married bachelor is to be contradictory. It's calling a square a circle, and saying it's a square circle. It is a square circle, and it's both a square and a circle. It's both a married and a bachelor. And if you don't accept that, you just don't accept the multi-orbed reality of what our world is actually entails. And that's your own shortcoming, Leighton. But of course, that shortcoming itself was determined by God on my system, and yet I'm rational in affirming it and mock you for stating it.
He can't do Genesis 50. He can't do Isaiah 10. He can't do Acts 4.
He can't, or you just don't accept all those interpretations that I bring with regard to how God can know and use the free actions of the king of Assyria, the free actions of Joseph's brothers, the free actions of Pharaoh, and thus strengthening him his resolve so as to bring about his purposes. Yet we have interpretations for all those. To pretend like we don't is just to strawman us, obviously. So we can. You just reject our particular interpretations of those passages.
He can't see the full orb. He's always smashed it down into that one layer, and
i.e., you've rejected the seeming contradiction of God determining evil but not being evil himself. You've rejected that logic. That's what he means by flattening it out. Just another appeal to mystery.
So that response that he gives each and every time really is what his brain is doing. And he literally is saying, yeah, well, I can only do what I'm determined to do. So I don't think it was a matter of, no, I've never ever thought about this before. I think he was saying, well, I normally get to say what I just said and don't get pushed farther, so now I got to come up with some way of expressing it in light of what this guy's asking. And it really didn't make much sense in what he was saying.
No, it didn't. The look on his face, though, when he was being pressed on it, spoke volumes to me, because it's like he got the record, the needle stuck. And it just kept going back and back over and over, and he couldn't get past that scratch.
Yeah.
On the record.
Yeah.
I wonder why God determined for my record to be scratched. Huh. Yeah, that's a joke. And it's also true on your system, which means your system is a joke. So instead of talking about determinism, why don't we go share Christ and show love? God bless you guys for tuning in. Thank you for those who support the Super Chats. If I missed a Super Chat, I apologize. Sometimes I don't see them as they scroll past so quickly. But I do appreciate those who support Soteriology 101. If you'd like to support us, you can click on the link in the show notes and become a one-time donor or become a monthly patron. You can also click on Trinity Seminary and learn more about how to get a higher theological education. We'd love to have you as a part of Trinity Seminary if you're looking to get a higher theological education. Thanks for tuning in. Now go share Christ and show love.